lot of training in anything in detail unless you become a specialist. I've been reading about vaccines since 2009, about an hour a day. I started reading about vaccines when I saw my patients getting hurt, and that was really hard for me. I didn't want to believe it. In 2003, you all, literally everyone would have hated me. Biggest jerk of a jerk doctor you ever would have met in 2003. Biggest ego of any doctor I think that was ever created. And when I walked into my community, I told everybody how blessed you are that I'm here now. And in the next 2 years, I noticed that there was a separation in my patient population. There were patients that were seeing a local chiropractor that were healthier than my other patients, and they were doing some other things for their health other than just using medication for whatever condition they might have. They also had a lower vaccine uptake, and they were healthy, and that was really hard for me to recognize. My partially or unvaccinated patients, and none of us liked them, quite honestly. Back then, they were going against their medical doctor's advice, and with the ego that I had, that was really hard to swallow. It took me a couple of years to start reading about vaccines, and the moment I started reading research about vaccines, changed my life forever. I didn't know anything beyond the vaccine information statements, where we find out that vaccines are perfectly safe. You'll become immortal if you vaccinate, and if you don't, all the babies in the world will die. And that's what the CDC wants us to believe, and I understand why they say what they say. When I started reading vaccine inserts, I was blown away at what had been studied or not studied, at the numbers of kids that were studied. A study of 2,000 kids, and then we start vaccinating 4 to 8 to 12 million kids to see what happens. And it changed my life when I saw vaccines having a higher injury rate than what we expected. We had a brand new vaccine that would come out, and we started vaccinating kids, and instead of a 1 in a million reaction, we were seeing kids, 1 in 100 being hospitalized, or having to create special rules that if you received a vaccine, you had to lay on the table for 20 minutes because you might pass out as you were leaving our clinic. Really hard for me. I am embarrassed to admit that I was still a vaccine bully, that in my practice we needed certain vaccine rates, and you couldn't question my authority, but then I started to make personal decisions for my own children, where we wouldn't give my kids any new vaccine that had just been released. A silly rule at the time for what I know now, but I was never going to test vaccines on my kids again. And in 2007 or 8, I forget, I experienced my first regression of autism with one of my patients. Now, you've all heard the same story, that they were born with autism and the doctor just didn't know that they had autism, and it's really hard to pick. No, that's not true. My background's in child development. I was working with kids with special needs. I had a perfectly normal child in my practice until they received his 12-month vaccines. When I walked into the room at a 17-month visit, I literally saw a child I'd never met before. I thought I walked into the wrong room. I stepped out to look to make sure I was in the right room because I did not recognize this child. He had regressed into autism, one of the saddest cases I've ever seen. And hard to admit that I struggled with recognizing that really happened to my patient. I still know the child today. I'm working with him. He's doing well. But it opened up my eyes. That's when I started reading about vaccines. A few years later, we had a patient die after his shots. They called it a SIDS death at 2 in the afternoon, a few hours after his vaccines. I remember the discussion, and I don't want to violate any confidentiality, so I'm going to be very careful with the words that I use. The coroner asked the ER doctor, do you think this was related to the vaccines that the child had earlier today? And the doctor said, well, no, it wouldn't have been the vaccines, implying, of course, that vaccines are perfectly safe, so it was marked as a SIDS death, and everybody moved on. My family has peace. It was SIDS. It was unavoidable. It was just a random bad event. But that's when I started reading about vaccines. And that led to a transition in who I am today. I also want to humble myself before you. I read about an hour a day about vaccines, and I work with moms in my practice that read 10 hours a day. They know more than I do, and that's amazing. And to all the medical doctors who are watching this...
By the way, that doctor is an MD and PhD. His PhD is in child development. He's board certified in neurology, and he also talked later on in the film about by not vaccinating, he was giving up $174,000 in additional income each year because he said that every doctor vaccinates makes a lot of money off of vaccinations. So he was honest. So good for him. And that he turned a corner. But he talked about being arrogant, and the doctor's right, you're all blessed to have me here. That kind of narcissism pervades the entire medical industrial complex, unfortunately. But I know those doctors didn't start medical school residency and internship with that attitude. But it is codified throughout the process of becoming what many consider almost a priest in the relationship they have. It's a sacred relationship. Unfortunately, it's not. So he's telling the truth. So is he now a killer? But based upon the concept going out now, the New York Times, Washington Post wants people arrested and put in jail if they're anti-vaxxers. He's an anti-vaxxer now because he is doing an hour a day of study. And as he said, the women that he meets are doing 10 hours a day. I'm going to show you just 4 days ago, this rally downtown. I was asked at the last moment, but I come to it and I told you I was going to be there. About 200 of you showed up, so thank you. We only had a few hours notice. But this is a group, and let me just give the proper group. It's learntherisk.org. Learntherisk.org. A group of people who are concerned about the lack of knowledge about vaccine safety and efficacy of doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and people. They were not there to protest. They were not there to rally. They were there to educate. And I have given them hundreds of my latest documentary on vaccines called Deadly Deception, which you can see for free. Go up and you just click it. Go to prn.fm and it's there, and you can click it and watch it, share it. I have 55 articles that Richard Gill and I have written on vaccines, everything you could ever want to know about vaccines, and deconstructing every one of the pro-vaccine arguments. Here are some of those women and their comments out there.
We're out here today to bring awareness to what is in vaccines and what's going on with the vaccine companies. I would say the most concerning piece of information right now are the significant conflicts of interest that are occurring between the CDC, Big Pharma, the FDA, the HHS. We have to bring awareness to the fact that vaccine companies are not being held liable for their products. In 1986, you could no longer sue a vaccine company because of serious vaccine reactions, and they were declared by court to be unavoidably unsafe.
I have a vaccine-injured child. He's 4 years old. His injury came from the vitamin K shot at birth because he has polysorbate 80. This is not in his medical records, and it is not considered a shot either. I only found out about the vitamin K shot after watching multiple testimonies of people who had children injured by the vitamin K shot alone. He has severe autism, and it's in a program that requires year-round intervention, and he just got kicked out of it.
I want to talk particularly about this vaccine coming out, the Gardasil vaccine, which they are going to next mandate in New York for children to go to school. And what I'd like parents to think about is this is an STD vaccine. It's also there to allegedly prevent cervical cancer. Why does the government care so much about my child getting cervical cancer? This is not the flu. This is not the measles. This is an overstep. All of the vaccines are an overstep. But what it comes down to is it is my body, my choice, my children, my choice. And I want particularly even pro-vaccine parents out there to look up the effects of this vaccine, all the children that it is harming. But beyond that, this is the United States, this is America, this is New York. And children should not be kicked out of school when choices like this are enforced on their families.
I am here because my little boy was severely maimed by a vaccine, and my husband and I were unaware of the nature of how vaccines were made and the ingredients in vaccines. And once we found out what was in vaccines, we realized that it was seriously against our ethical, moral, and religious beliefs to put this into our children's body.
My son Jagger was 18 months old. I took him in for his MMR vaccine, and 20 minutes later, he had a seizure. Over the course of about 20 to 25 weeks, he lost one function a day until he was no longer able to walk, talk, eat, sleep. I called an attorney to find out what my rights were, who's going to be accountable for my son's injury, and he told me nobody, that the manufacturer is immune. are liable for my son's injury.
I think what you're doing is terrific. There have been many demonstrations, especially now in California, where the proposition's passed and you have mandatory vaccination with no exemptions, not religious, not philosophical, and very few medical, and even the doctors who are offering medical exemptions are being harassed and they're being investigated. Even lawyers defending patients' rights are being harassed, and their license to practice law are being challenged. So understand something. There's a full court press by the entire establishment to attack you. Now, I believe that any reasonable person believes in freedom of choice. Because if you don't have a freedom to choose something with informed consent, then you're just a robot. You're allowing some authority figure, whether it's the FDA or CDC or a state health official, who may know nothing about you and your needs, to dictate what must go in your body. And when they make that a law, A, they're in violation of the Constitution, and then you can't speak. If you want to tell the truth, Google will censor you.
And we're not going to allow it.
Okay, but understand something. A small group like this will change absolutely positively nothing. You have to make the right energy move in order to get your cause become aware to the average person. So what do I suggest? I suggest that you realize the internet at this moment is still your friend. DuckDuckGo and some of the other places that are not censoring, because right now Google and Facebook are censoring everything on vaccines. And if you challenge vaccines, no matter what the legitimacy of your challenge, you're considered no better than a domestic terrorist. Actually, the Washington Post had an editorial where they want to have people who challenge the safety and efficacy of vaccines arrested and imprisoned. That's how rabid these people are. In my personal opinion, I believe that right now, the United States of America is Germany in 1932.
Yes.
Right? We're at the beginning of a massive fascistic approach. By the way, don't delude yourself that the Democrats and Republicans care about you or your issues. They don't.
Yes.
They care about themselves getting reelected, and your interests are non-existent. So you have to let them know you count, but you only count if you organize. And how do you organize? You could talk with 10,000 people here in this park, and you're not going to change very many minds. The internet... There is 27 more minutes of what I'm laying out as a way to go about helping your condition be made public. The damaged child and all those parents there came from being pro-vaccine to learning the truth about vaccine only when their child was sacrificed at the altar of greed and hubris. But there is a way that we can fight back. Now, to help everyone who's concerned, there are at least 3 more lawsuits that will be filed immediately to try to get a stay on the mandatory vaccines so your child can't go back to school. That's being done as we speak. My office here, virtually all the people here are working on articles that we're going to share with you. I'll broadcast them, we'll post them, and these are all meant to be shared with other people. In fact, today we've published our 3rd letter to every member of Congress, and this is by one of the new lawyers that we've hired, besieging them to hold hearings with Wikipedia, so people who've been victimized by Wikipedia can testify, and Wikipedia then, on the record under oath, can be held liable and accountable, and then from there, prosecution, producing the research that you can use. As I mentioned, we're doing 3 articles to show you the lies about polio and smallpox and measles. But we're also doing an article today showing you the politics and profiteering from that 1986 legislation that exempted vaccine manufacturers from being responsible. When you read this, when you hear me broadcasting it, you'll say, my goodness, it's all a fraud. That's correct, it's a fraud, which means that we then should get Congress to repeal that act. If you want to stop vaccines, mandatory vaccines, which just became up in Florida, mandatory vaccines yesterday, then you must remove the exemption and make the responsible parties liable. If you make manufacturers liable, mandatory vaccines will stop overnight. In fact, most vaccines will stop, which would be a good thing. So
Look,
tomorrow
when we
I'm
get
going
back,
to play 2 more
listen.
clips, including a
Let's
mother
make these earrings, and
sharing
it's going to be
a
a
lyrical
earrings and a pendant.
poem
Okay.
about her child. It's
These
very
gonna be-
powerful to listen to. So that's where we're at on that. Now, I began yesterday and only got into a short part of an original in-depth investigative article entitled, which is posted, Medical Skepticism, Today's Scientific Cultural Disease. This is a cult. It is not legitimate science. And Richard Gale and I, working for a long period of time, wanted to know who are these people who have no background at all, no clinical experience, they haven't done clinical studies, they don't have the degrees in the areas that they are criticizing and saying that are quackery. Well, they're called skeptics. There's not a lot of them, but they control Wikipedia on everything involving both politics, and they have a certain disdain for conservatives. They go after them. Well, what about uber liberals like myself and others? Oh, they go after you if you say anything that's anti-establishment. If you go after Big Pharma has an inordinate amount of control over what goes on. And we've exposed the pay-to-play. We've exposed the lack of any objectivity. And now what we're doing, we're deconstructing all their statements. Everything they've written, we're challenging. You'll see a whole series of these short articles that we're writing, deconstructing the skeptics to show they have no credibility, they have no background, they have no legitimacy, they have extreme biases. We have whistleblowers on our side, from inside Wikipedia. We know what we're talking about. So I wanted to share something a little deeper with you today, and it's about modern-day skepticism. And it is very powerful. In fact, if you want to know about chiropractic and you go to Google, Google's going to take you to Wikipedia. If you want to know about, let's say, intravenous vitamin C or the use of vitamins, no matter what you want to know about, you'll get something that disparages it, condemns it, considers it no better than lunatic charlatanism, quackery, pseudoscience. Even when the actual scientific peer-reviewed literature in the government's own website, the Library of Medicine, even studies supported by the National Academy of Sciences, our most respected scientific body in America, support vitamin D3 and vitamin C and what it does in the body. They'll say that's all nonsense. So boy, you talk about a cognitive disconnect, they have it. But what they do have, for this moment, just this moment, they have power. Because on the internet, primarily on Wikipedia, their ideology, their propaganda is the last word. And mind you, now Google is working with YouTube, which it owns, in order to decide which videos on anything involving a challenge like an alternative cancer approach or a questioning vaccines or GMOs or 5G, they're deciding Wikipedia, they've made Wikipedia the final arbiters of what is true. So if you want to know whether or not a video should be watched or whether it should be removed from the internet altogether, it'll be Wikipedia. The very same skeptics, these individuals do not have the training, the experience. They haven't done studies. They haven't published in the field. They haven't counseled patients. So they're saying, we few, just like this doctor you saw, we few who have no authority legitimately from academia or science, but we're going to judge you who have all the expertise and experience in clinical experience, and we're going to say to all of you, with no exceptions, everyone practicing, everyone receiving any form of alternative therapy, you are foolish, you're deluded. So these are the movement celebrity gurus, and they come almost from a religious, fervent perspective that they're entitled saviors. They're here to redeem modern civilization